Alright guys, so this is going to be the first lesson in your evolution unit. And this evolution unit is going to be a pretty big one. We've got several different things that we're going to be covering over the course of this kind of whole section on evolution. And we actually started it before spring break. You guys were supposed to be working on the Evidence of Evolution lab. And that particular activity is kind of dual purpose. It is going to be a combination of a lab activity, but it's also going to be kind of considered part of your notes. Some of those things will be talked about again as we go through the evolution PowerPoints, things like fossils and DNA comparisons. But I just do want you to understand that you need to be familiar with the types of evidence that are used to support evolution. Now, as with any other time that I cover evolution, I always want to start with just kind of some basics, because a lot of times people, when they hear that word, they immediately kind of have feelings about it. And it's a word that can be used or brought up at church and things like that. And so, number one, I just want to tell you that Miss Petty and I are here as teachers and not preachers. Okay, we're not trying to change any personal beliefs, but you are in a college level biology course, and pretty much all things in biology can be explained through evolution. Now, there are definitely some things that might, I guess, go against some of the things that you've been taught maybe in church, and I'm not telling you that you have to change those. But I do want you to be aware that not all of evolution is controversial, okay? So by definition, it's a change in the genetic makeup of a species over time, and we can see this, okay? It is well supported, widely accepted. We've seen, the process of natural selection in action and how that can lead to changes in species. It is a major theme in biology, and so we can't just ignore it, even though there may be some issues and some conflict with personal beliefs. I will that I do believe there is a spectrum, and I think I mentioned this first semester, but I do feel like that religion and science can coexist. I will never tell you where I am or my particular beliefs, but I don't think it has to be black or white, okay? Now, evolution does help to explain biodiversity on our planet today, and we can see evolution in action. So the way we're going to cover it is we're going to break it down into microevolution, which is what we're covering in this lesson. And I will tell you that really microevolution is not debatable, okay? There's nothing controversial about microevolution. We don't really start to see conflict until we get into the macro level, and we get into origin. And really, to me, that's where the main conflict lies, is where did we come from? And so when we get to those topics that might be controversial or that might create conflict, I just want you to know that for science purposes, for this class, you need to understand the concepts. You do not have to take them as your personal belief system. That is 100% a personal decision, okay? So I'm never trying to change what you believe. I'm simply telling you this is what biology or this is what science says. So I hope you understand that, okay? I'm never going to try to affect how you think on a personal level, okay? But for this class, I need you to understand the concepts of biology, which is what this class is about, okay? So really this lesson is going to focus on microevolution, and you do need to understand that individuals cannot evolve. Evolution occurs at the population level. It is a group. It is the species that changes over time, not an individual. I can't change my genetics and evolve in my lifetime, and neither can you. A single turtle can't evolve. A single bacteria can't evolve. A single fish can't evolve, okay? It happens at the population level. And so what microevolution is, micro of course means small. These are going to be small changes in allele frequencies. And so this is going to take us back to our genetics. And so I hope you understood genetics. But remember that alleles are different forms of a gene, okay? And so if we see changes in the presence of genes within a population, whether they increase or whether they decrease, if there are changes to the allele frequencies, then microevolution has occurred. And so this is what we consider small-scale evolution. We can see this happening with our own eyes in our own species and other species, this really is not debatable. And this is my issue when people just use the word evolution as just an overall bad thing, is because really there's no conflict with microevolution, okay? So allele frequencies can be altered in 3 different ways. The one that most people are familiar with, and really, people probably commonly associate with evolution, is natural selection. So it is not the same thing, okay? Evolution is the change. Natural selection is a mechanism for that change. So all 3 of these things here are mechanisms of change. They're mechanisms of microevolution, of these small changes that can occur in allele frequencies. So natural selection is probably going to be the main one, but there are 2 others. You could have genetic drift, or you could have gene flow. And so when it comes to natural selection, the key to natural selection is fitness, okay? If you're going to relate it to anything, natural selection is based on fitness, which is how well an organism can survive and reproduce. So essentially natural selection, sometimes commonly called survival of the fittest, it's the process in which those individuals that have, I guess, the best suited traits, they are more likely to survive, they are more likely to reproduce, and they are more likely to pass those traits on to their offspring. So this is why we call it survival of the fittest. Organisms with the higher fitness, now it could be strongest, it could be fastest, it could be the best camouflaged, it could be the smallest. It really just depends on the environment, okay? So natural selection is driven by survival and reproduction. And so naturally, we have variation in the populations, and certain organisms will have an advantage over others. So those that have an advantage will survive and reproduce better and more likely pass on those traits that help them to survive. So this is how we get adaptations. Okay, adaptations occur due to natural selection working on a population. And so here's just kind of a general summary. So here we have the birds. They clearly prefer the green beetles. And so what would happen over time is that by being the other color, these beetles, these alleles are going to increase in the population over time. The green may decrease in the population over time. It doesn't mean we're making something new. We still have beetles. It's just certain alleles will go up, certain alleles will go down, and that's what microevolution is all about. So there are 4 conditions in order for natural selection to happen. Number 1 is variation, variation, variation. Okay, this is going to be key, because if natural selection depends on fitness, then organisms within a population will have variations that either cause them to be more fit or less fit. So if you just take a look at just the students in your classroom, look at all the variation just in this one small group of people. And this is just physical on the outside. People have different hair and hair colors and eye colors and skin colors, and people are different heights and weights. There's so much variation with all of our traits, and that's not even looking at things like blood type or our immunity. So variation are just those differences within a population, different colors, different sizes, different patterns, and so variation has got to exist in order for natural selection to occur. There's got to be overproduction. We could also say there has to be death, okay? In a population, there will always be more organisms produced than can actually survive. Why this may be sad, it's the truth in nature, okay? As humans, we'll go to great lengths to save the runt of the litter, or we always root for all of the sea turtles to make it to the ocean, but in reality, that doesn't happen, okay? There will always be more offspring that will survive, that will be produced than can actually survive. So death is just part of that change, okay? There's also going to have to be a struggle for existence. There's going to have to be competition. If everything is plentiful, if there are no limitations, then there's no reason to have a higher fitness than the next guy, okay? So there has to be a struggle to, eat. There has to be a struggle to survive, and that will help to drive natural selection. And then there also does have to be a relationship between fitness and survival. Certain traits are going to have to provide an advantage and increase fitness. Other organisms will have to have a lower fitness, and therefore that will affect how well they survive and pass on those traits to the next generation. And so when it comes to that first kind of requirement, variation can be created in a variety of ways. One important way is just by simple mutation. Remember, they're random. You could have little point mutations where you have like an A instead of a T. You could have amino acid changes to your proteins. You could also have chromosomal mutations where you have, extra pieces, missing pieces, extra whole chromosomes, missing chromosomes, all those things that we talked about first semester. So mutations can lead to variation in populations. And then one of the most important ways is essentially recombination, which boils down to sexual reproduction. Remember that even in asexual populations like bacteria, they can still get variation through mutation. But your sexually reproducing populations are going to have more variation because of meiosis, independent assortment, crossing over, and that's going to lead to offspring that are different from the parents. So variation is good, and the more variation, the better, because that ensures that at least some members of the population will hopefully survive. And so mutations can be good, bad, or neutral, okay? It really just depends on where, what gene, what's affected by that mutation. So sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Sometimes we saw that they don't change the proteins at all, so they could have no effect whatsoever. Or mutations could be in some pieces of DNA that aren't necessarily gene material. But mutations can help maintain that variation. How quickly they occur and where they occur, all of that is random and it varies. And it's because of mutations that we might get new alleles. So like for instance, red hair is due to a mutation in the gene for melanin, and it creates another protein known as pheomelanin. And so sometimes new traits can arise or new alleles can arise simply because of mutation. Now, the thing is when it comes to natural selection, it only plays on those things that are actually genetic. You know, some things, like we could have variation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to pass those things down to our children, okay? So there's kind of two different types of traits that we're looking at, and this is going back to our genetics lesson. But we have qualitative characters, and these are those things where you pretty much have like one gene, and we have a couple of phenotypes. Like for instance, you could have freckles or you don't have freckles. You have a widow's peak or you don't have a widow's peak. And so what we call these different phenotypes are morphs, okay? So pretty much if, let's say you had a trait like freckles, for whatever reason, if people with freckles had an advantage, what could happen is over time you might see an increase in the genes for freckles and a decrease in the alleles for no freckles, okay? It's not going to change anything majorly, it's just going to change how frequently you see those alleles. But most of our traits are going to be quantitative, which means they vary along a spectrum or a continuum. You know, if you look at things like height, weight, skin color, eye color, these are what we call polygenic traits. And so in the case of quantitative characters, what happens is we have shifts along a spectrum. So if you have just a couple of different morphs, you may see an increase in certain alleles or a decrease in certain alleles. But if you're looking at phenotype and you have this spectrum, what's going to happen, you will see movement along this spectrum in three different ways. So we have directional selection, and I have a picture here on the next slide, and so I'm actually going to go forward and backwards. So imagine that we have, let's see, this is where I need my board to write. I'm going to try to write, it may not work out very well, okay. But let's say we have, let's say we have a light color, okay. This could be fur, this could be skin, it could be whatever you want it to be. Let's say we have a really, really light, and then we have a really, really dark. I was afraid that was going to happen, okay? So what happens is a lot of times when we have these spectrums of phenotypes, you'll see kind of fewer at the extremes, you'll see more in the middle, and then you'll see fewer at the other extreme, okay? We get what's kind of this, what we call a bell curve. So directional is going to be if one end of the spectrum is favored. So let's say that the darkest fur blended in the best, okay? And so what you would see over time is a shift toward that end of the spectrum, okay? You would see a shift in one direction. So we call that directional selection. Now, disruptive is where, let's say, the lighter ones had an advantage, the darker ones had an advantage, and so what you would see is you would see an increase on this end, you would see an increase on this end, and you would see fewer of those phenotypes in the middle, okay? And then stabilizing selection would be where if the middle phenotype was favored. So let's say if they were medium colored, then they had an advantage. You would see an increase in the middle, and you would see a decline on the extremes. And so what's going to happen is your curves are going to kind of shift depending on what's favored in that environment. So here we have the original. You kind of have this basic bell curve. You know, this could be height, shortest to tallest, okay? Think about the human population. You're going to have a smaller number in the shortest range, like below 4 foot, and you're going to have a smaller number in the highest range, like over 7 foot. Probably the majority of the population is going to fit somewhere in the middle, creating this bell curve. Now, if one end is favored, okay, if one end is favored, like really tall, you would see a shift in that direction. In this case, darker is favored, so you see a shift in one direction. If average was favored, you'd see a shift toward the middle, okay? It doesn't mean all the others go away completely. You just see an increase in certain areas of that continuum. And then disruptive is where the two extremes, so maybe really short had an advantage and really tall had an advantage, and the medium height did not. You would see this kind of disruption in the middle. So that's what happens when you have just like a your quantitative characters there, okay? So all of the directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection, that's when you have this continuum, okay? Now, if it was a qualitative character, certain genes go up, certain genes go down, okay? So it really just depends on what kind of trait it is. All right, now natural selection is not the only way that change can happen, okay? Natural selection can also happen due to random changes. So the key word to natural selection was that it was based on fitness, okay? Certain individuals had a better chance at survival. When it comes to genetic drift, it is purely a change in the population due to a random event, okay? And this tends to happen and affect small populations more. So this has nothing to do with whether organisms are fit or unfit, okay? Now, we have two examples. We have the founder effect and we have the bottleneck effect. So imagine that you have the classroom that you are in, okay? You have a set number of students. Now, if you were to compare your class to the whole population of Pleasant Grove High School, you may kind of notice that your group may not fully represent all of the genes and alleles that are present at Pleasant Grove High School. So the founder effect would be something like your class decided to kind of start their own school, okay? Maybe you became isolated from Pleasant Grove and y'all decided to start your own school. That new population would not have the exact same genetic combinations as the original whole Pleasant Grove High School because your little group does not fully represent all of the possible alleles. So it could be something like birds were migrating and a group of them got blown off of course, and so they are creating their own new little population. The alleles present in that small random group may not fully represent the original group, okay? So that would lead to change. It was purely due to randomness, okay? Now, the bottleneck effect has to do with survivors. So let's say a fire started and your class was the only surviving class of Pleasant Grove High School. As you begin to repopulate, once again, you may not fully reflect the original, okay? So this is just going to be due to a random event. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you're in the right place at the right time, and survival is based on luck, and whoever survives or whoever is part of that new population, those alleles may not be fully representative of the original. And so here you have an example of the founder effect. And then here you have an example of your bottleneck effect. So founder effect is about kind of starting a new population, and the bottleneck effect is about a survivor type of thing. And then the third type, or the third mechanism that can cause microevolution is gene flow. And so the key word for natural selection was fitness, the key word to genetic drift was random, and the key word to gene flow is movement, okay? It's going to be due to migration. So you're going to have movement of individuals into your population, or you could have movement of individuals out of your population. And anytime you have movement that can either introduce new alleles or remove alleles from a population. So imagine that 3 students got added to your class, okay? That could alter the allele frequencies within your population. Or if students left, that could alter the gene frequencies within your population. So natural selection was due to fitness, genetic drift is due to random changes, and gene flow is due to movement or migration. And so that takes us to the very last thing that we're going to talk about in this lesson. And we're going to continue with Hardy-Weinberg in your next lesson. But essentially, Hardy-Weinberg is a concept that describes a population that is not evolving, okay? And we call the state of not evolving genetic equilibrium. Now, here's the deal. The whole purpose of genetic equilibrium and the Hardy-Weinberg theorem is to show that we cannot maintain it, okay? Because in order to maintain genetic equilibrium, which means no change in allele frequencies, 5 conditions have got to be met, okay? According to this theorem, in order to stay the same genetically, generation to generation to generation, these 5 conditions would have to be met. There would have to be no mutations in the population. Well, that's not going to happen, okay? Mutations are random. We can't really control that. There has to be complete random mating, which means there is no selection in the mating process. Individuals just mate with whoever, whenever. They don't select mates based on color or dances or any particular characteristic. Very few populations are completely random maters, okay? A lot of times there's usually some type of reason that they pick a mate, okay? There can be no natural selection, so there can be no changes based on fitness. There can be no changes based on variation. Well, that's not going to happen in a natural population. The population has got to be large, and you can have no random changes. That's not going to happen, okay? And then lastly, there can be no gene flow. There can be no migration in or out of the population. Well, that's not going to happen, okay? So once again, the whole point of these Hardy-Weinberg, I guess the whole point of the Hardy-Weinberg theorem is to show that it's pretty much impossible to maintain genetic equilibrium, because in order to stay the same, you couldn't have mutations, you'd have to have random mating, natural selection couldn't happen, you'd have to have a large population with no random changes, and you'd have to have absolutely no migration. There's not going to be a natural population on the planet that is going to be able to meet these 5 criteria. And so, if you're not in genetic equilibrium, then the population is evolving. So the whole purpose of the Hardy-Weinberg is to show that change is happening. Now, we're not really going to focus on this too much right now, okay, but we are going to work on some Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equations, and we're going to learn how to calculate allele frequencies. And so I'm just going to leave it at this for today, and we will come back and we will talk about this in our next video. So I hope you guys have a great day. You do need to finish up your evidence of evolution packets, and you'll be turning those in the next day or so. But keep in mind that that is a set of notes as well. And I look forward to seeing you soon.